The midnight call that changed everything on the evening of November 14th, 2019. The town of Hawick, nestled in the rolling hills of Cumbria, experienced one of those bitter northern winters that seems to seep into the very stone of old buildings. The temperature had dropped to -3 degrees Celsius, and a thin layer of frost coated the hedgerows along the A591 as darkness fell at 4:30 in the afternoon. Local residents remembered this particular Thursday for the way the wind carried an almost metallic scent, the kind a T Chinese letter before snow. By 8 o'clock that night, snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the slate roofs of the town's Georgian terraces with a powder that would later become slush beneath the boots of police officers. Hawick is a place of just over 4,000 souls, where most people know their neighbors by name, and the most exciting event of any given week is usually a charity quiz at the White Lion pub. It is the sort of town where doors are left unlocked and strangers are noticed, a place where the rhythm of life is measured by the church bells at St. Mary's and the twice-daily arrival of the post. So when Detective Inspector Sarah Cunningham received a call at 11:47 that night, the quiet equilibrium of this small community was about to shatter in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The call came through to Cumbria Police's control room from a mobile phone registered to a Sandra Marsh, a 52-year-old school receptionist who lived alone in a detached house on the outskirts of town. When the operator answered, Sandra's voice was frantic, barely coherent. She kept repeating that something was wrong, that she could hear something in her house, that she had heard a sound like a door being forced. The line was crackling, and at one point the operator heard what sounded like footsteps on wooden flooring. Then the line went dead. 2 patrol cars were dispatched immediately, officers arriving at Sandra's property on Fellside Road at 11:58, just 11 minutes after the initial call. What they found would set in motion an investigation that would consume the next 18 months and leave the town of Hawick questioning everything it thought it knew about its own residents. Sandra Marsh was discovered in the kitchen of her home, seated in a wooden chair, her wrists bound behind her back with what officers later identified as the plastic ties used for electrical cabling. She was alive but unresponsive, her lips tinged blue from cold, her bare feet ice-cold to the touch. The thermostat in the house had been turned down to its lowest setting, and the windows had been opened, letting in the bitter November air. Sandra was taken by ambulance to the Cumberland Infirmary in Carlisle, where she would remain in a coma for 4 days. When she finally regained consciousness, she told detectives a story that seemed almost too strange to believe. She had been asleep in her bedroom on the first floor when she was awakened by the sound of breaking glass downstairs. She had crept to the top of the stairs and seen a figure moving through the hallway below, carrying a torch that cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. She had retreated quietly to her bedroom and dialed 999 on her mobile phone, but before she could speak, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She hid in the wardrobe, but they found her, she said. They had tied her up and taken her downstairs, demanding to know where she kept her valuables. When she told them she had no cash, no jewelry of any real value, the figure had grown angry. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sensation of extreme cold. The investigating officers, led by Detective Chief Inspector Martin Hale, found the house in exactly the state Sandra had described. A rear window in the utility room had been smashed, its fragments scattered across the linoleum floor. A torch, its beam still switched on, lay on the hallway carpet. Drawers had been pulled out and rifled through, but nothing appeared to be missing. In the kitchen, the chair where Sandra had been found stood alone beneath the overhead light, its wooden legs scuffed from what must have been a struggle. What puzzled the investigators most was the thermostat. Why would an intruder deliberately lower the heating? The theory that emerged was a disturbing one. Sandra's captor had wanted to keep her cold, to slow her metabolism, perhaps to extend the time they had to question her or simply to exert control. It was a method that suggested planning, intention, a knowledge of how the human body responds to cold. Or perhaps, As some on the investigation team quietly wondered, it was something else entirely, something that spoke of a particular psychology. Forensics teams worked through the night, the torchlights cutting through the darkness outside as snow continued to fall. They recovered a partial footprint from the garden path, a size 11 men's boot with a distinctive wedge sole pattern. They found a single fingerprint on the window frame, later matched to a local man named Thomas Reeve, 34, who lived in a flat above the newsagent's shop in the town center. Thomas Reeve had previous convictions for burglary, all of them residential, all of them committed in the Hawick area. He had served 2 sentences, the most recent ending 18 months before the attack on Sandra Marsh. He had been released from HMP Haverig in May of 2018 and had apparently gone straight, holding down a job as a delivery driver for a local grocery service. His probation officer described him as quiet, compliant, someone who kept himself to himself. When officers went to question him on the morning of November 15th, they found him in his flat, still in his pajamas, apparently surprised to see them. The fingerprint was a powerful piece of evidence, and Thomas Reeve was arrested and taken to police headquarters in Penrith. He denied any involvement in the incident at Sandra Marsh's house. He said he had been home alone that night, watching television, and had not gone out. When confronted with the fingerprint, he claimed it must have been from some previous occasion, perhaps when he had done odd jobs for Sandra years ago. He could not explain how his fingerprint had ended up on the window frame of a house he claimed never to have visited that night. The case seemed straightforward, a textbook identification leading to a swift arrest. But as the investigation deepened, complications began to emerge that would call into question everything the police thought they knew. Sandra Marsh, when she was well enough to give a full statement, described her attacker as tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and what appeared to be a balaclava. She could not identify him by face, only by build and voice. The voice, she said, was low, rough, someone who did not sound local. Thomas Reeve was of average height, 5'9", and many who knew him described his voice as high-pitched, almost boyish. Furthermore, the footprint found at the scene was a size 11. Thomas Reeve, according to his own probation records, wore a size 8. DCI Hale found himself facing a dilemma. The fingerprint pointed clearly to Thomas Reeve, but almost everything else about the physical description seemed to exclude him. Either Sandra was mistaken about details that seemed significant, or something far more complicated was happening. He ordered a forensic review, hoping that additional evidence might resolve the discrepancy. The results, when they came, were troubling. The fingerprint on the window frame had been deposited sometime in the previous 72 hours, consistent with the night of the attack. But the forensic team also found a second fingerprint, one they had initially overlooked, on the interior of the kitchen door. This print belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose DNA would later be recovered from the chair where Sandra had been tied. The second individual had never been in any police database. They did not exist, as far as the records were concerned. As the weeks turned to months, Hawick found itself gripped by a mystery that refused to resolve. The town, so used to its peaceful rhythms, was now a place where locks were changed, where neighbors watched each other with new suspicion, where people wondered who among them was capable of such a thing. The local newspaper, the Hawick Gazette, ran the story on its front page for 7 consecutive weeks. The BBC sent a correspondent. Internet forums filled with speculation, theories, accusations. Thomas Reeve was released on bail in December 2019, his case still under investigation. He moved away from Hawick, his probation transferred to a different county, his life uprooted by an accusation he continued to deny. In interviews with his solicitor, he expressed frustration, even despair, at being unable to prove a negative, at having to live under the shadow of suspicion without any way to clear his name. Sandra Marsh never fully recovered. She moved away from Hawick as well, relocating to a flat in Manchester where she knew no one and no one knew her. In a single interview she gave to a regional television program, she spoke of how the attack had stolen something from her, something she could not name. She said she lived in constant fear, checking locks, jumping at shadows, unable to sleep without the lights on. When asked if she thought Thomas Reeve was guilty, she paused for a long moment before saying only that she wished she knew for certain. In March of 2021, the Crown Prosecution Service announced that there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone with the attack on Sandra Marsh. The case remained open but inactive, a file in a cabinet, a mystery that had simply run out of leads. The second fingerprint had never been matched. The footprint remained unexplained. The questions that had haunted the investigation from the beginning persisted, unanswered. DCI Hale, in a rare public statement, acknowledged the frustration that everyone felt. He said that the investigation had followed every reasonable line of inquiry, but that some cases, for reasons beyond their control, simply could not be brought to a conclusion. He thanked the public for their patience and urged anyone with new information to come forward. But there were those who wondered whether the investigation had truly followed every lead. A former detective on the case, speaking on condition of anonymity, suggested in a podcast 2 years later that certain avenues had not been explored as thoroughly as they might have been. He mentioned a name, a local man who had worked as a heating engineer and who had access to every house in Hawick. He mentioned that this man had left the area abruptly in December 2019, that his employers had described him as reliable, punctual, someone who kept detailed notes. He mentioned that the man had once been treated for a psychiatric condition that involved episodes of dissociation. He said no more, but the implication was clear. This name, if it was ever formally investigated, never led to any action. The heating engineer, according to records, had moved to Australia, where he started a new life. He never returned. Tonight, the house on Fellside Road where Sandra Marsh was attacked stands empty. The estate agent's board has weathered and faded, and locals say it has been broken twice by vandals, though no one has ever been caught. The window that was smashed has been replaced, but if you look closely, you can still see a faint line in the putty where the new frame meets the old stone. In Hawick, the case has passed from active memory into something more like folklore, a story told at dinner parties, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can find a way in. People still disagree about what happened on that November night, about who was responsible, about whether justice was ever truly possible. Some say the real culprit was never found. Others say he was found but could not be proven. And some, usually in whispered conversations at the White Lion after closing time, suggest something darker still, something that the police either could not or would not see. Sandra Marsh, in her final public statement, said only this: "I know what happened to me. I know someone came into my home and tried to take something from me. But I will never know who, and I will never know why. That is something I have had to learn to live with. Some nights, I still hear footsteps on the stairs." The question that haunts this case, the question that no one has ever been able to answer, is not simply who attacked Sandra Marsh that night. It is this: how many other houses in Hawick did this person enter before, and how many will they enter again, now that they have vanished into the anonymity of an ordinary life somewhere? Perhaps watching the news, perhaps reading about the unsolved case, perhaps smiling to themselves in the dark.